Despite its stunning beaches, global tourist attractions, and overall natural beauty, Florida's primary headline maker is its unique breed of people. These individuals are usually summed up by a single phrase that captures their creativity and ingenuity as a group: the Florida man. Whether you think they're creative, funny, or stupid, you can't argue that the Florida man and woman have left their marks on the state. But their legacies might be more significant than you think. Florida's always had criminals, but the people paving the way for the increasingly moronic modern felons weren't meth heads stuck in sewers. They were clever, ruthless men, whose influences would span the country and cross international borders. Before long, singular criminals would realize that there's strength in numbers, and, as it turns out, with the right planning and organization, small-time criminals can make it big. Really big. Organized crime and gangsters in Florida played a pivotal role in shaping some of the largest and most popular destinations in the state today. These early offenders would share social circles with celebrities, run international drug smuggling routes, work with and against the FBI and CIA, prop up foreign governments, take down foreign governments, and even plot to flat-out assassinate world leaders, including the American president. Some of their stories are so unlikely and so memorable that they sound straight out of Hollywood movies. Instead, many of these characters were the foundation of several silver screen blockbusters and best-selling books. This is an overview of how gangsters and criminals can shape history and change states. This is the history of the Mafia in Florida. The concept of organized crime and the Mafia isn't a native Florida thing, of course. Like with the annoying snowbirds in the Sunshine State, a lot of it can be traced back to New York originally. Many people are aware that Mafia activity around the country really flourished in the 1920s at the start of Prohibition. But while the ban of alcohol may be what propelled many crime families to new heights, it was far from their beginnings. Semi-organized street gangs were prevalent in New York as early as the 1890s. Largely made up of newly arrived immigrants, early gangs often centered around heritage and ethnicity. When the members weren't actually related by blood, cultural ties in gangs and mafia families were very strong. Simply put, they looked out for their own kind, uniting along ethnic or cultural lines against a very Anglo society at the time that was new to most of them. Most early prominent mafia leaders were immigrants. In New York and the Northeast, where the American Mafia found its first foothold, aspiring members were often Italian or Jewish, reflecting the demographics of the immigrants into that area just prior to the 1900s. These new residents settled into working-class slums in the cities. Oftentimes, young boys looking for money, power, a sense of belonging, or a combination of the three, formed street gangs to take on their new country. These gangs would grow over time into more sophisticated, organized criminal groups. While the gangs of New York would make their way down into Florida and have a significant effect on organized crime in the state, they weren't the very first to do it. While European Jews, Italians, Greeks, and Russians were filing into New England at the turn of the century, the largest immigrant group into the Sunshine State at the time was Cubans. Along with some Sicilians, these early immigrant groups would be the ones to band together in Florida in the early days. For time's sake, I won't go into full detail on Florida's earliest days, with prominent historical figures like Vicente Martinez Ybor, Henry Plant, Henry Flagler, early Tampa Mayor John Perry Wall, and more laying the groundwork for major Florida cities to prosper. Consequently, their actions would also set up the ideal foundation for gangsters to plant their seeds into the new Florida land, and eventually grow a thriving criminal underworld there. For more info and greater context on how these figures and their actions framed what would become the Mafia portrait in Florida, feel free to check out the article I wrote on my website, floridaman.media. I'll link it here and also put it in the description below. The main thing you need to know for now is that by the time Miami was founded as a city in 1896, Tampa across the state had been well established by early Florida standards for nearly 50 years, thanks in large part to a notable Cuban population. As railroads began to connect both cities to the rest of the state and the rest of the country at the turn of the century, organized crime began to take shape. Early Tampa was swelling with new residents and businesses in the early 1900s. As people of all types began to move to the area to try to make a living, Their vices came along with them. Opium was a popular illegal drug at the time that had been around in Tampa since the existence of Fort Brooke, an old military base built on Tampa Bay. Once a crucial outpost for the United States military during the Seminole Wars, Fort Brooke ceased formal operations in the 1880s, but the legacy of the opium dens that were present on the base didn't quite fade away. Opiates were also a common part of many medicines at the time, so, probably not coincidentally, morphine, heroin, and opium were common recreational drugs around the turn of the century. A few clever early gangsters in Tampa capitalized on opium's popularity, happy to satisfy the public's need. Joseph M. Cacciatore, commonly known as JoJo, was a Tampa drug dealer in the early years of the 1900s and arguably one of the city's first kingpins. With his business originating from 7th Ave in Ybor City, he sold drugs throughout Tampa and eventually beyond state borders into the southeast. For some more information, I sat down with well-known organized crime writer Scott Deitche, who was kind enough to share his thoughts with me. Deitche, a Tampa Bay resident, has authored several books on the Mafia, including Silent Dawn and Cigar City Mafia, two works focused on events in and around Tampa and the rest of the state.
I think you start seeing organized crime, underworld figures start becoming active in narcotics in the late 19-teens, post the criminalization of heroin and morphine, and definitely post-prohibition, so post-1920. That's when they really start becoming more active and start establishing drug networks, not only internally here in the Tampa area, but up through Kansas City. There's a really strong narcotics pipeline that extends from Tampa up through Kansas City from the 20s into the early 1940s.
Jojo Cacciatore wasn't the only man in early Tampa looking to cash in on the drug trade. Another of the city's early major drug dealers was Jorge George Zarate. Coming to Tampa as a teenager from Cuba, Zarate quickly became embroiled in the city's growing underworld. He got involved in morphine sales and illegal gambling. The way Zarate's tale unfolded is interesting, and on brand with a Florida man. Zarate was arrested in 1928, but notably was pardoned by President Herbert Hoover after spending less than 3 years in jail. There's very little information on why he was pardoned. Zarate would return to Tampa and his gambling ways after being freed, but after a murder attempt and another arrest where he narrowly beat the charges, he left Florida for New York in the 1940s. Zarate would eventually align himself with legendary mob boss Lucky Luciano and continue dealing in the Northeast. Cacciatore's and Zarate's stories seem to mirror the success stories of other young immigrants turned gangster, although with a Florida twist. But the final and arguably the most significant delinquent to find his way into organized crime in Tampa's early days was not an immigrant, but a wealthy white young man. He was not a new settler finding his way, but rather a well-established native with strong roots to the Tampa area and a highly connected family. He decided to ditch the high society he was born into after both of his biological parents died when he was young. Charlie Wall, son of former influential early Tampa Mayor John Perry Wall, was one of the young city's first organized crime bosses, with not drugs, but rather gambling being his primary moneymaker. Charlie Wall got his underworld start in his early teens when he began hanging out at illegal gambling houses around Ybor. He eventually got employed at one and began working his way up the ranks. After learning the ins and outs of the illicit business, Wall was able to establish his own network of Tampa area gambling dens by the 1920s. When discussing illegal gambling and organized crime in early Tampa, it's important to know that one game primarily drove the industry. Remember, gambling wasn't a normal thing like it is now back in the early 1900s. The first legal casino outside of Nevada didn't open until the 1970s, and Florida wouldn't establish its state lottery for another 10 years or so after that. In early Florida, illegal gambling was a gold mine. Gambling is a powerful vice that would branch out into secret backroom casinos, illegal gambling houses, and more, that eventually helped create some of those popular destinations in the state. But, before its growth and state sanctioning, the roots of the lucrative industry were in one game in Florida: Bolita. Bolita, translating literally to little ball in Spanish, was originally a Cuban game, which explains why it flourished in Tampa at the turn of the century. Bolita houses were extremely popular in Ybor City, and you could often play the game in corner stores, butcher shops, and more on the low. From a player's perspective, it was easy to play. Usually there was a bag with 100 numbered balls, and you just had to pick the winning ball. Bets as low as a penny were often accepted, making it very accessible for the poor and working class, which again were often immigrants. From a gangster's perspective, it was easy to rig. Since the balls got mixed up in a sealed bag before the winning one was selected, racketeers found plenty of discreet ways to fix the drawing. Whether a game was rigged or not, a Bolita seller would always need a bank, or a source of money. This is where your friendly organized criminal came in. Wealthy gangsters bankrolled Bolita sellers around Tampa. Organized crime groups also paid off the police to overlook Bolita houses. And, of course, a mobster would come in handy if a seller ever got the urge to nudge out a rival operator, or maybe needed some muscle when dealing with a delinquent debtor. According to Scott Deitche, there were over 300 Bolita houses in Ybor City alone by 1927. Drugs and Bolita dominated Tampa and Ybor City's underworld in the first 2 decades of the 1900s. Charlie Wall and Jojo Cacciatore were making money hand over fist. But the organized crime picture and every citizen's life would change in 1920. Thank you for watching. If you found this topic interesting, please subscribe. I needed to go over a lot of the background info in part 1 to put things for part 2 into perspective. So in the next video, you'll start hearing all of the big names and see how crazy things really got. Also, for more pictures and interview segments that didn't make this video cut, check out the stories on the website floridaman.media. The corresponding article series there on Florida's Mafia history goes even deeper, all the way back to day 1, basically. Thanks again for watching.